Welcome to the Alcove. I'm Mark Malero. My guest today is Naomi Klein. She is an acclaimed journalist, writer, and activist, perhaps best known for her best-selling book from the year 2000, No Logo, hailed by the New York Times as a movement Bible of the anti-globalization movement. She's here today to discuss her new book, The Shock-Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. As well, we have a clip of the short accompanying film to The Shock-Doctrine by Children of Men filmmaker Alfonso Cuarón. Here's a look at that film.
A collective trauma, a war, a coup, a natural disaster, a terrorist attack puts us all into a state of shock. And in the aftermath, like the prisoner in the interrogation chamber, we too become childlike, more inclined to follow leaders who claim to protect us. One person who understood this phenomenon early on was the most famous economist of our era, Milton Friedman. Friedman believed in a radical vision of society in which profit and the market drive every aspect of life, from schools to healthcare, even the army. He called for abolishing all trade protections, deregulating all prices, and eviscerating government services. These ideas have always been tremendously unpopular, and understandably so. They cause waves of unemployment, send prices soaring, and make life more precarious for millions. Unable to advance their agenda democratically, Friedman and his disciples were drawn to the power of shock.
The subject should be rudely awakened and immediately blindfolded and handcuffed. When arrested at this time, most subjects experience intense feelings of shock, insecurity, and psychological stress. The idea is to prevent the subject from relaxing and recovering from shock.
Friedman understood that just as prisoners are softened up for interrogation by the shock of their capture, massive disasters could serve to soften us up for his radical free market crusade. He advised politicians that immediately after a crisis, they should push through all the painful policies at once before people could regain their footing. He called this method economic shock treatment. I call it the Shock-Doctrine.
Welcome.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could give us an idea of this term that you've coined, the Shock-Doctrine. Where did you come up with this, and what does it mean economically in terms of shock therapy?
Well, the Shock-Doctrine is the term I'm using to describe a philosophy of power. And the philosophy is that if you want to push through economic shock therapy, the free market revolution, the best time to do it is in the aftermath of some other kind of shock, a shock that prepares the ground, that softens up a society, disorients people. So that's the shock doctrine. The first shock prepares the ground for the second shock, the economic shocks.
Okay. And in terms of the economist Milton Friedman, you talk about essentially 3 decades of Friedman-esque kind of Chicago school economics that, you know, were first applied in Chile and now are being applied in other parts of the West. Is this, in terms of it being an idea, is this an overarching idea? Is this a completely new idea that you're proposing?
Well, what I'm doing with the book is providing an alternative history of our contemporary economic era, the chapter we've been living in the U.S. since Reagan, in Latin America since the 70s. You know, it's this revolution started in different parts of the world in different moments. In Eastern Europe, it was after the Berlin Wall fell, and so, you know, the timing is different in different parts of the world. It did begin 35 years ago in Latin America. There's a broad agreement on this, that we have been living a new chapter, and that Milton Friedman was the guru of this chapter of history, about what's often described as the triumph of the free markets. And I think we've been living living with a fairy tale version of how this economic model spread throughout the world. And there have been some, what I call the official stories. One of them was a PBS series called Commanding Heights, which was a three-part series on the great battle between Hayek and Friedman and Keynes.
Right.
And so what I'm doing with the shock doctrine is I'm covering the same ground, but I'm telling the story differently. Because in the official story, you don't hear about the importance of shocks and crises. What you hear is that free markets and free people go hand in hand, that this ideology spread throughout the world because people wanted it, because they wanted their Reaganomics with their Big Macs after the Berlin Wall fell. So this is the official story. When Milton Friedman died in 2006, there was a retelling of that official history, the merging of the idea of this radical vision of free markets and democracy, which is the 2-for-1 deal that has been sold to us by people like Francis Fukuyama, and so I'm telling the same history, the same chapter, but I emphasize different key dates. Many people, when they tell this history, they begin with Thatcher and Reagan. I begin with Pinochet, because that's really when it began, and because it is a victor's history, the one that we get, and so it's been cleansed of the unflattering details, like the fact that it started under a military dictatorship.
Yeah, it's interesting because I know with Friedman that I'd seen a documentary on him, and he had argued that he was a mere economic advisor to Pinochet.
Well, Friedman was a mere economic advisor. He went to Chile in 1975, and he provided some very specific economic advice to Pinochet. Pinochet took that advice. There's a correspondence between the two of them that is now public. But Friedman's influence went far beyond just that trip. The real influence, and this is why it's much bigger than one man, has to do with the influence of the people Latin Americans call the Chicago Boys. The Chicago Boys are a group of economists who were trained at the University of Chicago under Friedman and his colleagues in the 1950s and 60s. There were roughly 100 Chilean Chicago Boys, Chileans who came to the University of Chicago. The reason why this is bigger than Friedman is that it wasn't Friedman's idea to bring them there. This was a program of the U.S. government, of the State Department, and it was developed in the 1950s because there was a great deal of concern at the State Department that Latin America was moving to the left, much as there's a great deal of concern at the State Department today that Latin America is moving to the left. So there was this discussion of what to do about the pink economists in Latin America. This is a phrase that was used by USAID's, the head of USAID's Chile office. And through conversations with the head of University of Chicago's economics department, they came up with this idea. Now, what's important to understand is that in the 1950s, University of Chicago, under the economics department, at this point was quite a marginal radical school of, represented quite a marginal radical school of thought. The U.S. at this stage was fully in the grips of Keynesianism. So the influence in the U.S. Over policy was held by Keynesian institutions like Harvard and Yale at that point.
Right, because Friedman was an outsider.
Friedman was an outsider. He described himself and his colleagues as this, sort of band of marginal, voices in the wilderness, really, in this phase. But precisely because they had this radical vision of the world in which the market should control every aspect of life, that they were advocating. He was advocating privatizing the post office, national parks. These were crazy ideas in the 1950s. But the idea of what was called the Chile Project, the idea of bringing Latin American students, their tuition paid for by the U.S. government and later by the Ford Foundation, was that by training this group of students under these very radical right-wing economists, that they would be a counterpoint to the socialists in Latin America, and there would be a battle of ideas. So the influence of the University of Chicago and the influence of Friedman under the juntas of Latin America, and hundreds of students went through these programs. It extended from Chile to Argentina, Mexico, Brazil. The influence went well beyond Friedman. It was that a generation of politicians was trained in this radical ideology. They went on to be finance ministers, heads of the central banks. They went on to work for the IMF and the World Bank,
Okay.
and they were really the proselytizers of this ideology.
Okay. And it's interesting when you talk about Iraq in the book because you describe essentially the shock doctrine as a three-step process. I was wondering if you could describe that process for us.
Well, in the book I talk about three distinct forms of shock which reinforce each other.
Right.
And a sort of a circle of shock, if you will.
Yeah.
The first shock is the shock to countries. It's the crisis. And in Iraq, it was called shock and awe. It was the military invasion. It was an invasion strategy based on a theory that you needed to put the entire population of Iraq into this state of shock and awe to convince them of the futility of resistance. If you read the shock and awe manual, it spells it out.
Yeah.
So that was the first shock. The second shock was Paul Bremer arriving in Baghdad in May of 2003 in his trademark Brooks Brothers suits and
his boots
and his Timberland boots,
right. Yeah.
And declaring Iraq open for business. Now it's so much has changed, and Iraq is spiraling in chaos today that one can forget that first summer of frantic lawmaking under Paul Bremer. But this was a period actually of relative stability in Iraq, and and this is where you actually can see very clearly what the Bush post-war plan was. We often hear they didn't have a plan. Well, they had a plan,
But it didn't necessarily work.
It didn't work.
Right.
Yeah, it backfired badly.
Yeah.
But there certainly was a plan, and Paul Bremer implemented that plan with great enthusiasm. The plan was to turn Iraq into a model free market economy. And when they were finished, then they were going to have elections. And it's very important to get the order right.
Yeah.
Because Iraqis actually they had this crazy idea that they should have elections first, and then they should have a democratic government decide what the economic policies that would govern their country should be. Yes, very backwards people. But of course, Bremer and Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld and Cheney knew better, and their plan was to push through. Bremer wrote 100 laws, edicts. They were very, very radical, and they often talked about them as if they were just sort of technocratic little housekeeping measures. But in fact, the economists described it as the wish list for foreign investors. Foreign companies were allowed 100% ownership over Iraqi assets. They were allowed to take 100% of their profits out. But these are laws that are unheard of in the region, which is actually very protected economically. But these were radical laws anywhere in the world. They were laws that Bremer pushed through, that the Republican Party has been trying to impose in the United States and never been able to, like a flat tax.
Right.
Iraq got a 15% flat tax in this period. So that was the economic shock.
Yeah.
That's the economic shock therapy program. And it was based on this theory that Iraqis would be so disoriented and reeling from the shock and awe invasion, focused on daily concerns like the fact that, say, they didn't have electricity or water, and that they wouldn't be able to resist these economic shocks. Richard Armitage, who I quote in the book, former Undersecretary of State under Powell, said that the theory was that Iraqis would be easily marshaled from point A to point B. Now, of course, that didn't happen.
Right.
And Iraqis did organize in that first summer, and they demanded elections. In fact, there was a series of local elections. There were protests almost daily outside the Green Zone. People wanted their jobs back. They were very against, particularly the foreign investment law. The Iraqi business people organized, opposed this law, and as that mostly nonviolent resistance turned into the armed resistance, then there was the emergence of the third shock that I talk about in the book, and that is the non-metaphorical shocks to bodies, the shock of torture.
Yeah.
And torture is always an enforcement tool. I think we talk about torture in a very narrow way in this country. Does it work? Does it get reliable information? But the real meaning of torture is that it's a tool of state terror. It's a way to gain control over a country that you can't govern with consent. If you can't govern a country with the consent of the people, then you have to govern it through fear. And a classic way of governing through fear is the use of torture. Because it says to a people, and Saddam used it to great effect.
Absolutely.
You crossed me, and this is what happens to you. Well, torture is a tactic of state terror, and we talk about torture as if it's only about getting information. And we forget that torture is primarily about transmitting information to the broader society. There are two goals of torture. There's what happens between the interrogator and the prisoner in the cell, and there is what the use of torture says to a society, right? What it transmits. And what it transmits is, cross us and anything can happen to you. Right? And that message, has been transmitted by the Bush administration again and again. I mean, think about Cheney going on Meet the Press and going, well, we're going to have to spend some time in the shadows.